Welcome back to Wrong Sports, going back into college basketball content since we are still in March Madness time. I'm going back to some more teams that were so close to winning the national championship. These are great teams that did not win the national championship between 1970 and 1980. I did pre-1970. If you didn't see that, you can see that in the link below, also in the upper right-hand corner. But before I start the list, I have to do some honorable mentions. The 1983-84 North Carolina Tar Heels were the defending national champions. They still had Michael Jordan. They were a 2 seed in the 84 tournament, but they would get upset by Georgia, who were a team that finished with a 500 record in the SEC and needed to win their conference tournament to even get into the NCAA tournament. Next up, this honorable mention didn't even get a chance at the NCAA tournament. That's because they didn't even win their conference. This was one of those teams that didn't make the tournament because of the one bid rule, which I talked about in my previous video. This is the 1970-71 USC Trojans. They were 24-2. They were ranked number 5, but because the Pac-8 only sent the conference winner and there was no conference tournament, USC were pretty much screwed because UCLA beat USC in both games in the regular season, meaning UCLA were the Pac-8 champions and earned that spot in the tournament, and they would win another NCAA national championship. USC would not be able to get past UCLA until Wooden retired, and USC wouldn't even be able to make it to the NCAA tournament until 1979. So those are just 2 honorable mentions and examples of this list. But before I get into my list, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below. Ring that bell so you can get updates on brand new videos that I will be dropping in the future. Plus, I will also be having some exclusive content on my Patreon right now, patreon.com/wrongsports. You can check out some there right now. I will also be putting up some more content on there in the future. I have free memberships, I have paid memberships. Either one will get you some content. And also, if you like this video, please give it a like and share this video and share this channel with other college sports fans. And once again, this list will be done in chronological order because it's really hard to rank teams, especially a list of the best teams to not have won the NCAA tournament. So I'm just going to play it safe, go in chronological order, and I'm going to start it out with the first year of the 1970s, that being the 1970-71 Marquette Warriors, kicking it off with a team that was one of the best programs of the 1970s, and it was mostly because of their recruiting and coaching of their head coach, Al McGuire. He would also have some great assistants like a Hall of Famer and Rick Majerus, who helped to build up these great Marquette teams of the late 1960s and 70s. Marquette were coming off of a 26-3 season and the NIT title. The reason why they were in the NIT and not the NCAA is because their head coach Al McGuire didn't like where Marquette were seated, and they denied the invite the previous year. So for the 1970-71 season, Marquette were even better, as they were undefeated in the regular season and ranked in the top 5 all season. And this season, they would accept their invite to the NCAA tournament, and they would make it past the first round. But in the semifinals of their region versus Ohio State, there was a controversial 5th foul called on one of their best players, an All-American guard, Dean Memminger, who was then benched for the final 5 minutes. In that time, Ohio State would manage to get past Marquette by 1 point, eliminating this great Marquette team before they even made it to the Final Four. And they also ended Marquette's winning streak at 39 games. Number 2 is from 1973-74. It's the UCLA Bruins basketball team. So going to give some background on this UCLA team going in to the 1974 tournament. They were coming into this tournament winning the last 7 national championships. They were also bringing back their senior Bill Walton, who had only lost 3 college games, and all 3 of those losses were actually in this season. That was because the previous 2 years, UCLA were undefeated. This year was also famous because it was the end of UCLA's undefeated streak of 88 games, which was ended by Notre Dame, and then they lost back-to-back games for the first time in almost a decade. So a very strange UCLA team, but they were still 23-3 and ranked in the top 5 and on their way to another NCAA tournament. They would make it to the Final Four for the 8th consecutive year, but in a game that Bill Walton calls the most disappointing outcome of his entire basketball career, UCLA would lose to NC State, and this was after UCLA lost a 5-point lead late in regulation and a 7-point lead in the second overtime, which NC State rallied back to end up winning the game. This was quite the shocking loss and quite the shocking upset for an NC State team, and I don't think an NC State upset that many people talk about. A lot of people talk about the upset that happened like a decade later, but not a lot of people talk about this one. Anyway, though, UCLA would make up for this loss by winning the next 2 national championships for John Wooden, as he would sail off into the sunset being a national champion. Number 3, I'm going to the next year of 1974-75 and the Indiana Hoosiers, who are a stacked team, with Bobby Knight even saying this team was his best ever. It was led by his consensus All-American Scott May, who would help Indiana finish the regular season 29-0 and winning the Big Ten Conference by 6 games. When combined with the following year, Indiana won 37 consecutive Big Ten games, which was just incredible. In addition, the Hoosiers won their conference games by an average of 22 points, just another insane stat. However, their season drastically changed in an 83-82 win against Purdue on February 22nd. That was because they lost their consensus All-American Scott May to a broken arm. Indiana would win their final 3 games to remain undefeated at number 1. In tournament play, however, they would end up winning their first 2 games by more than 10 points before facing Kentucky in the Elite 8. Kentucky and Indiana played earlier this season, and Indiana blew them out. But in this game, Scott May wouldn't play as much, as he would only play 7 minutes, and he had a cast on his arm. Because of that, May would only score 2 points, but even with May being a non-factor, Indiana almost pulled it out, as they only lost by 2, 92-90. Kentucky would end up making it to the national title game and lost to UCLA, which means we could have had a John Wooden versus Bobby Knight, and it would have been in Wooden's final game for the national title, but alas, we didn't get any of that. Indiana would make up for it by going undefeated again the next season and would win the national title. So Indiana were so close to having an undefeated streak like UCLA had they not lost May to that injury and had not lost such a close game to Kentucky. Number 4 was a tough pick because it was tough to pick which one of the final DePaul teams that were coached by Ray Meyer that I was going to pick. So I'm going to go with 1980-81. It's because this season was, I guess, the worst gut punch out of the 3 that I could have gone with. Anyway, let me get into this a little bit, because if you don't know about Ray Meyer, he had been the coach of DePaul since 1942 and had 2 Final Four appearances. And funny enough, one of those was in his first season of 1943. But for the next 3+ decades, he would build DePaul into a powerhouse, as he only had 3 losing seasons out of 42 years. Plus, he would help to make college basketball in the Chicago area even better with his teams and his rivalry with Loyola University, also in Chicago. But going into the 1980-81 season, Ray was nearing the end of his career, as he was 67 and had built what many saw as his finest team. He had gone to his second Final Four in 1979 with the future number 1 pick in Mark Aguirre. He was only a freshman that season, so he would come back for the 1979-80 season and follow that up by leading DePaul to a 25-0 record and being ranked number 1 before they would lose their second-to-last game of the season and then getting upset in the first game of the NCAA Tournament. Yeah, that was a pretty bad gut punch. Now with Aguirre as a junior in 1980-81, he would also be named the National College Player of the Year, as he averaged 23 points per game, and many thought this was the year for DePaul and Meyer. DePaul would have a random loss in the middle of the season, but otherwise they were ranked number 1 or number 2 most of the season, and ended up being 27-1 and were a number 1 seed in the 1981 tournament. They would get the first round bye and play the 9th seed St. Joseph's. The game was looking like another win for DePaul, as they led by 1 with 12 seconds left, and their guard Skip Dillard on the foul line. Dillard was 85% from the line, but he would miss the first of a 1-and-1, and St. Joseph's rebounded it and managed to get a basket to score the shocking 49-48 win. DePaul would also be a 26-win team the next year and get upset in their first game again, but this year's loss was worse because they had the best player in college basketball at Al Aguirre and couldn't get to the Final Four. Ray Meyer would coach DePaul until 1984, but he would never get to another Final Four. Okay, I'm cheating a little bit for number 5 because it was really tough for me to pick which one of the Virginia basketball teams starring Ralph Sampson that I was going to pick. So I'm going to pick the last 3 teams that he was on. So from 1981 to 83 teams I'm going to pick. And the reason is because when Ralph Sampson came to UVA, he was immediately seen as a game changer. When you're 7'4" and not many people are close to your height, that makes you quite the game changer. As a freshman, UVA, who were coached by Terry Holland, would be 24-10 and win the NIT title. Sampson, as a sophomore in the 1980-81 team, which is the first team of the trio that I'm putting on this list, would start 23-0, but then they would lose 2 of their last 3 games and get upset in the ACC tournament. But they would still end up going to the NCAA tournament since they were still a 25-win team at this point. And in the NCAA tournament, they turned away 3 teams with their stifling defense and would make it to the Final Four. In the Final Four, they would meet their conference opponent in North Carolina, who would end their season. This 1980-81 team was going to be my pick out of the 3 Sampson teams because this team was the closest to the national title. The next season of 1981-82, they would start 27-2, including splitting their 2 games versus North Carolina and co-winning the ACC. But again, Virginia lost in the ACC tournament final to, of course, North Carolina. And then as a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament, they lost a brutal game to the number 9 seeded UAB, who were only in one of their first few years of Division I basketball. That might have been one of their most brutal seasons, but yeah, the 1982-83 season, which was Sampson's senior season, might have been even more embarrassing. And this team would get a big addition as they got a transfer in Rick Carlisle, who came from Maine. With another great guard coming in, and most of their starting 5 having 2 or more years of starting experience, Virginia were a preseason number 1 team. But then they lost to tiny Chaminade College in one of the biggest upsets in college basketball history. It's really one of the biggest upsets in college sports history. Because Chaminade College were like an NAIA college. They weren't even NCAA, basically. They were only in this tournament because Chaminade is always in the Hawaii tournament that happens. But they never usually win. And this upset was so crazy, there's not even a lot of video and pictures of this game because not a lot of people believed that it was going to happen. But anyway, even after that big upset, UVA would still be 29-5 and get into the NCAA tournament again. In this tournament, though, they would make it to the Elite 8, but once again they were bounced by an ACC foe in North Carolina. But not University of North Carolina, this time the North Carolina State Wolfpack, who would end up winning the national championship that year. That's the team that everyone remembers. And it's crazy that during Ralph Sampson's 4 years at Virginia, the team would go 112-23. They won 1 NIT title and only had 1 Final Four. But way more was expected of Virginia and Sampson during this time, and unfortunately, they really didn't reach those heights. And number 6 is another team like Virginia with multiple teams to choose from, but in the case of the Houston basketball teams in the 1980s, I'm going to go with the 1982-1983 Houston Cougars basketball team. They had a junior in Clyde Drexler, a sophomore in Akeem the Dream Olajuwon, as well as Michael Young to make up Phi Slamma Jamma. Guy Lewis, the longtime head coach, was still there, and I mentioned how he had some great teams in the 1960s that got close to a title, and it would happen again here. Houston started the season a little slow as they were 5-2, but right around Christmas they found their stride and beat down the remaining teams on their schedule to win 22 games in a row, including winning the Southwest Conference tournament. As the number 1 seed, it was Olajuwon who would dominate in the tournament, as he averaged a double-double to get Houston to the Final Four. This was Houston's first Final Four in about 15 years, and they would play what many people thought was the second best team in Louisville. And this Final Four game would be another great performance for Phi Slamma Jamma and Drexler and Elijah, who would both have over 20 points, and they would win this game by 13 to make it to the title game. In the title game, they ran into destiny in Jim Valvano and the NC State team, who slowed down Phi Slamma Jamma, and in one of the most played moments in NCAA tournament history, lost in a last-second slam dunk shot, which was just the perfect ending to this game and upset that NC State had. And I picked this Houston team over the team that they had the previous year just because of how dominant Houston was this year and how close they were to actually getting that national title. They were winning this game up until that last-second slam dunk by NC State. Fortunately, Houston would make it to the title game again the next year, but lost to the new dominant team in Georgetown. And speaking of Georgetown, they're going to be number 7 on my list. This is the 1984-85 Georgetown Hoyas, who would have some great teams right around the same time as Phi Slamma Jamma. That would be because they had their own great big man in Patrick Ewing, and a Hall of Famer in their head coach, the towering John Thompson. Georgetown would get their first national title in 1984 after beating Houston and would be bringing back most of their starters, including Ewing. But they also had very good forwards in David Wingate and Reggie Williams, and Bill Martin, who all stood 6'5" or taller. So with this towering starting five, it was looking like a repeat for Georgetown. The Hoyas would only lose 2 games in the regular season, which would actually end up giving the regular season title to their rivals, St. John's. But Georgetown turned it on and were undefeated through February and March, winning the Big East tournament. As a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament, Ewing, who was the National Player of the Year, dominated and would lead Georgetown to the Final Four. In the 1985 Final Four, it was pretty significant because there were 3 Big East teams, with Georgetown having to play St. John's first, the team who they lost the Big East regular season title to. In the Final Four rematch, it was a no contest, as Georgetown stopped St. John's best player in Chris Mullen, and Georgetown was in the title game for the 2nd year in a row. In this title game, though, they would play a huge underdog, and a team who they played in the regular season before, that being the other Big East team in the Final Four, Villanova. Villanova would set the record in the title game for shooting efficiency, as they were 22 for 28 in field goals and 22 of 27 from the line. Villanova only missed 1 shot in all of the second half. They could do nothing wrong. Even though Villanova were shooting out of their minds, Georgetown were not, as they were shooting at a rate of 59%, and this game was actually pretty close, as Villanova were able to just barely pull it out, 66-64. It is generally considered one of the biggest upsets in tournament history, and a reason why this Georgetown team makes the list, just like the previous Houston team I mentioned, because Georgetown were so close to repeating as national champions, but due to out-of-this-world shooting by Villanova, they were denied. And number 8 is a team that I grew up watching while I lived in northern New Jersey. Even though I grew up on Big East basketball, there was one team that wasn't in the Big East that I constantly heard about and watched, and that being Temple. I'm going to go with the 1987-1988 Temple Owls team, and I'll talk about them in just a little bit, but Temple were a scrappy team that always played a hard out-of-conference schedule, and they also had a matchup zone defense, which made them a dangerous team when tournament time came around. Along with that, they were coached by an absolute legend in John Chaney, who had built small Chaney State in Pennsylvania to winning the D2 National Championship, and when he got the Temple job, he continued that trend. Chaney got to Temple in 1982 and immediately turned Temple into a 20-win season, and then in 1986-87, Temple won 30 games. Coming into this season of 1987-88, Chaney would recruit Mark Macon, who teamed well with their captain and guard Howard Evans, and also their forward Tim Perry. Macon would end up being a second-team All-American as a freshman and averaged 20 points per game, along with playing well with the Atlantic 10 Player of the Year in Tim Perry. With this great talent, Temple would destroy Atlantic 10 teams as they went 18-0 in the conference and were 29-1 and were a number 1 seed going into the NCAA tournament. They would score big wins over Lehigh and then got a big one over Georgetown and then Richmond to make it to the Elite Eight to play Coach K and Duke. This game was going to be a tough one because Duke would match up well with Temple's matchup zone defense and fought them off to end up winning and knock Temple out. Chaney and Temple would continue to make it to the tournament, but he could never get over the hump of the Elite Eight to make it to the Final Four. And actually, Chaney would make it to the Elite Eight 2 or 3 more times in the next 20 years, but again, just could never get over that hump of getting into the Final Four, unfortunately. I picked this Temple team due to the talent they had, the great record, and the fact that John Chaney also won Coach of the Year honors too. Chaney was like most coaches on this list who has a Hall of Fame resume, but just couldn't get that national title, and in Chaney's case, just couldn't get that Final Four appearance. And I'm staying in this year with another hell of a team that fell to an upset, that being the Oklahoma Sooners. Oklahoma this year were led by Billy Tubbs, and they had players like Mookie Blaylock, who set the record for steals, and they also had big man Stacey King. Behind these two players and an up-tempo, high-scoring offense, they wiped the floor with many teams, scoring over 100 points in more than half of their games, which was pretty rare at this point. When the 1988 tournament kicked off, Oklahoma were 30-3 overall and were a number 1 seed, and continued with their high-scoring beatdowns as they won their first 4 games by an average of 10 points or more. And when they made it to the Final Four, they beat Arizona to set up a Big 8 rematch for the national title as they would play Kansas. Kansas lost both of their regular season matchups to Oklahoma, but only by 8 points, and they kept Oklahoma to scores lower than usual in both of those losses. Kansas would have an All-American this year in Danny Manning, who would score 31 points and had 18 rebounds, while also helping to hold off Blaylock and Stacey King for Kansas to score the 83-79 upset and take away the national title from Oklahoma. Oklahoma and Tubbs would never get this close to the national title again, and due to them having such a high-scoring and dominant team, only to fall to a team that barely got into the tournament, helps this 1987-88 Oklahoma team make the list. And finally, at number 10, it's the 1988-89 Illinois Fighting Illini. And actually, this team was called the Flying Illini because they were so athletic that they can run and alley-oop baskets even with backups. Their starting 5 were one of the most talented teams that Illinois ever had, as they had Kendall Gill, Steve Bardo, Nick Anderson, Kenny Battle, and Larry Smith starting. Behind this starting 5, they would have a great head coach in Lou Henson, and Illinois would go 27-4 with a 14-4 conference record, which would earn them a number 1 seed in the NCAA Tournament. The tournament would see their scoring rates go down just a little bit, as they were averaging in the low 70s instead of the 80s and 90s like they were doing in the regular season, but they would still get past Louisville and Syracuse to meet their conference foe, Michigan, in the Final Four. Michigan was an underdog since they lost to Illinois twice already in the regular season, and also Michigan had an interim head coach because they fired their head coach before the tournament, and I'm not even going to get into that. So because of all that, Illinois were favored to move on. The game would be one of the most exciting games of the year, as there were 33 lead changes during the game, but Michigan managed to hold off Kenny Battle and Kendall Gill to win by 2 and eliminate the Flying Illini. This team makes the list because of how cool and modern this team was because of the alley-oops and the slam dunks they were doing, but they follow the trend of other teams on this list in that they lost their national title due to losing to a conference opponent who they dominated in the regular season. And that's what makes losing in the national title game to Oklahoma, who I mentioned previously, or Illinois like I mentioned now, it made it even worse because they lost to a team who they dominated in the regular season. Even Virginia, when they lost to NC State in the Elite Eight game, that was embarrassing too. But anyway, tell me what you think. Tell me if there's another team who you would put on this list of great teams who did not win the NCAA National Championship in the comments below. Make sure, as always, you like this video and share this video and share this channel with other college sports fans. And please check out my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports for exclusive content.